Great. Welcome back, everyone, to the Ethica Regulatory Change series. In this webinar series, we hope to provide helpful guidance on CPS 230 compliance so that you have the practical knowledge to uplift your operational resilience. Today, we will be spending the next 30 minutes focusing on another important operational hurdle, business continuity management. But before we do that, a quick word from our sponsors.
The world has changed. We have changed. Ethica Group is meeting the moment with a woman-led advisory and talent firm, placing integrity at its core, leading by example for a more equitable future. At the forefront of emerging tech and regulation, we operate across key technical areas, providing pragmatic commercial support and superior talent solutions for businesses navigating change. Driven by purpose, we give back. Ethica elevates modern workplaces and strives to uplift humanity, empowering change for better tomorrows today.
Great. So to those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name is Ramona Roach and I'm the CEO of Ethica Group. We are an advisory and talent solutions firm focused on regulatory change and innovation and tech. Today, I'm joined by Richard, one of our risk and compliance experts, and Susanna, one of our legal advisors. Thank you both for joining me again. Okay, panel, so let's jump straight in. Why does the topic of business continuity resonate with you, Richard?
Well, as we've seen just recently with Optus, disaster recovery and BCP is essential because having a well-organised, constructed and tested plan helps organisations to prepare for and navigate against disruptions and safeguard their operations and their assets, protect their reputations, and also helps them meet their regulatory obligations. In this day and age, where there are many disruptions, we reliance on third and fourth parties, a lot of technical operations, it's essential that you have a good BCP plan with a well-orchestrated communication strategy.
Absolutely. And you can really tell when that plan isn't there or is a bit weak, right? So, Susanna, from your experience?
Well, from my experience working in-house and navigating through past and emerging disruptions, I've learned that having a commercial mind is important for operational resilience. I've seen the ramifications of business continuity management situations, and it's important to remain on the front foot. You need to stay a step or 10 ahead and remain proactive rather than reactive. That's why ensuring you have a well thought of plan in place is key to compliance and overall success.
Thank you both. So in our webinar today, we're going to give you in-depth insight into the requirements and expectations of the regulation in relation to business continuity. So please do submit your questions and comments in the Q&A tab, and we'll try to get them all answered today. What's really great about Ethica is that we run a full-service firm, so cross-functional implementation support by our team is seamless when you need both advice on preparing and implementing a BCP, but also insights on regulatory compliance. So let's get into it. Susanna, how does business continuity fit into the CPS 230 requirements?
Pictured there on the slide are 4 work streams that need to be implemented to ensure compliance with the regulation by the deadline. We've already covered what's required for service provider contracts and management in previous webinars. Whilst we haven't released the webinars for governance and operational risk yet, it's important to understand that the 4 concepts are important and related to one another. Compliance with the work streams is something entities must work on concurrently and not in a linear fashion, one after the other. APRA has said it will be checking for the existence of a change management plan for each of these work streams correlating to the requirements of the standard.
I mean, to even get it all done, you pretty much have to be working on all 4 of the work streams anyway, right?
That's right.
So let's recap the key takeaways from our last webinar. Susanna, can you take us through that?
In our last webinar, we focused on the management of service providers. We highlighted that APRA expects regulated entities in 2024 to have a service provider management policy in place. We went through the life cycle of service provider management, key obligations, and highlighted the new ones. We provided some insight into challenges, gave practical tips, and provided some examples. We also focused on how technology, specifically AI, can be used to help you uplift service provider management, and we went through some practical examples.
Perfect. Okay. So we're now going to move on to that key pillar of business continuity. What do the regulations say in relation to business continuity, Susanna?
The Draft Prudential Practice Guide says operational resilience is the outcome of prudent operational risk management, the ability to effectively manage and control operational risks and maintain critical operations through disruptions. An important part of operational resilience is ensuring that there are appropriate business continuity measures in place. APRA's intention with the new BCM regulations is to ensure that organisations are focused on prioritising customers and any possible financial harm that may occur to customers as a result of these disruptions, and making sure that any financial harm is minimised. Under CPS 230, an APRA regulated entity must do 5 things to operationalise BCM. They must define, identify, and maintain a register of critical operations. That register should include a name and description of the critical operation, as well as the tolerance levels for disruptions. They must take reasonable steps to minimise the likelihood and impact of disruptions to its critical operations. Maintain a credible BCP. This plan should explain how the organisation will keep running its critical operations when facing various types of disruptions, staying within acceptable levels of performance. Part of this planning is to ensure that they have strategies to recover their vital computer systems and data. Activate its BCP if needed in the event of a disruption, and return to normal operations promptly after a disruption is over.
Thank you. So the first step here in planning an adequate BCM is obviously to identify your critical operations. And feedback we've been getting from industry is that these new concepts are actually quite complicated to interpret. So I know that we've covered this in previous webinars, but can you remind us, Susanna, what do we mean by critical operations?
Critical operations are processes undertaken by a regulated entity or its service provider, which, if disrupted beyond tolerance levels, would have a material adverse impact on its depositors, policyholders, beneficiaries, or other customers, or its role in the financial system. APRA has clearly stated it does not expect entities to rely solely on the minimum list of activities prescribed by APRA as critical operations. It is the responsibility of an entity to identify its critical operations by assessing all business operations within the entity to identify which operations are critical. It is worth noting, however, where a critical operation is not appropriately self-identified, APRA may step in and require the regulated entity or a class of APRA regulated entities to classify a business operation as a critical operation.
Okay, and Richard, we've talked about the definition of critical operations before, but what are some common examples and how are they identified? Because obviously understanding these concepts is really important to getting your BCM right, isn't it?
Yes, it's not only a fundamental component of BCM, but of the whole of CPS 230. And I think we've outlined before, if you're a bank or insurance company or a super, it's what services are you providing to the customers and what are the critical aspects of that enable those services to be provided. For example, for an ADI or a bank, payments, deposit taking and management, custody and settlements, they are all key aspects of that. I think for life insurers, it's claims processing is a key one. And look, for an RSC, licensed RSC, it's going to be the investments, payments, distributions, even calculations of NAVs. These are all key things which would be part of, or the processes linked to, would be critical operations.
Okay, great. And Susanna, just what the regulations require in respect of developing and maintaining.
The APRA regulated entity is to develop and maintain an assessment of its operational risk profile, appropriate monitoring, analysis and reporting of operational risks and escalation processes for the operational incidents and events, BCPs that set out how the entity would identify, manage and respond to a disruption within tolerance levels, and are regularly tested within severe but plausible scenarios, and processes for the management of service provider arrangements.
Okay, so there's obviously a lot for entities to do with respect to BCM. But turning to the board now and the level of governance required here, how can the board gain proper oversight of the requirements for critical operations?
We'll discuss this issue of tolerances in a bit more detail shortly, but the board must approve the BCP and tolerance levels for disruptions to critical operations, review the results of testing and oversee the execution of any findings.
And
Yeah,
Richard,
I think, yeah, just to add to that, Ramona, and governance, and I know we have another session on governance, but governance is key. And I think the regulators have made it quite clear in the guidance and in CPS 230 that the role that they expect the board to play. The board has a pivotal role to play in making sure that you have appropriate plans, you have appropriate resources, even to the level of definitions of what a material service provider is, and making sure that the 4 work streams that we've discussed earlier are resourced, implemented, and don't forget you've got the implementation of FAR coming online at the same time, or earlier if you're an ADI. There's broader expectations in relation to making sure there are approved persons for the correct implementation of CPS 230, and that the board is provided with the requisite information for them to and to enable them to make informed decisions.
Perfect. Okay, so why don't we turn to a quick poll now? Audience, let's see what stage most of you are at when it comes to BCM. How are you going with defining, identifying and maintaining that all-important register of critical operations? So I'll just give you a minute there to answer the Slido. That should come up on screen. So it looks like from the answers there that some of you have got to the stage of defining those critical ops, and that's really great. I think that really helps inform, as we said, the other work streams under CPS. So that is a good result. But let's turn now to a few tips on how to implement a BCM efficiently. Richard, what are your top tips here?
Yeah, I think you really need to conduct a comprehensive risk assessment to identify potential threats and vulnerabilities that could disrupt your ability to implement your BCP. Now, one of those would be having clear trigger points and decision-making processes for activating your BCP. This will closely be linked to your tolerance levels. So making sure you have that connectivity between when your tolerance levels are getting close and the people responsible for activating BCP is essential. Then this goes on to my next point, is making sure you have an incident response team with clearly defined roles and responsibilities. This is key to having clarity as to who needs to do what, when. And I think, and I know just looking at the Optus, and there's been a lot of where Optus could have done better is ensuring there's an effective communication plan and coordination during the activities. And for that, it's even as simple as making sure contact details are up to date and that people are monitoring tolerance levels, know who to communicate with when there could or is likely to be an issue. The other key thing is, remember, this is a living document. And one of the sort of findings from a recent review from the FCA is that you need to keep your plan, your BCP plan, up to date, and that it reflects changes in technology or risks as the business change or as you're adopting new technologies or new dependencies on that.
They're such great tips. Thank you. Couple more, I guess, from my end. Building on what you've said there, Richard, you need your BCP to be future-proofed, and that means, for example, that the detail in it is employee agnostic to basically avoid any key person risk. But also, another tip is to consider having your internal audit team or an experienced independent third party review your plan and I guess provide that comfort that boards and senior management have actually taken those reasonable steps in meeting the requirements. Okay, let's move now to everybody's favourite topic, setting tolerance levels. This is really a topic in itself, but we're just going to try and give you, I guess, a high-level view, and I'm sure that there will be questions on this. But how do we set tolerance levels, Susanna?
Well, for each critical operation, an APRA-regulated entity must establish tolerance levels for the maximum period of time the entity would tolerate a disruption to the operation, the maximum extent of data loss that the entity would accept as a result of the disruption, and the minimum service levels the entity would maintain whilst operating under alternative arrangements during a disruption. Similarly, APRA may require an entity to review and change its tolerance levels for a critical operation. Alternatively, APRA has the power to set tolerance levels for an entity or a class of entities where it identifies a heightened risk of material weakness. The DPG 230 says that when setting and testing tolerance levels, an organisation should consider the impact on its customers and other stakeholders, the impact being financial or reputational on the entity for a prolonged or material disruption, the financial or reputational impact on the broader financial system, including any flow-on effects or contagion, any legal or regulatory requirements, including any tolerance levels set by APRA, lessons learned from previous episodes of business disruptions and scenario analysis, and recovery objectives that have previously been defined by the entity as superseded CPS 232.
Great. Okay. And Richard, practically speaking, when we're talking about tolerance levels, do you have any examples here of how you set them?
Well, I think it's really how long you think your customers can actually, what's the level of inconvenience before it causes harm to your customers for having their key services not being available. Like particularly if you're not able to use payment systems, if you're not able to pay people, not able to use, if you're in a shop or you're in a restaurant or other aspects, any indication where you can't use payment, credit cards, other aspects, can have major repercussions for small, medium and large businesses if you're an ADI. I think other areas of like insurance companies and where that can be quite complex and timely need for claims processing, particularly if you've got delivery and payment when you're actually needing services provided there. That's also a key area is like what would, and it's not what the insurer can tolerate, it's what can the customers tolerate. And I think that's the same. So it will vary between the services that are being provided. And, you've got to look at super funds, for example, and payments and so forth. People, particularly elderly people, will be relying on those payments, and also be worried if they're not coming, and there can be knock-on implications of that. So it's taking back, as I've always said, take a sort of a helicopter view, look at the services you're providing, look at the services you're being paid for, and how critical are they to those people operating their daily lives to assure they can continue to operate in a manner which is satisfactory for them.
Right. And I mean, that says to me that you just have to be very well engaged with your customers. So you're looking at, I guess, feedback that's coming through, whether that's from, complaints handling or feedback lines, and looking for that steer from the customer as to what they will tolerate, right?
No, exactly. And I think, and I don't want to beat up on Optus, but I'm sure a number of institutions who are regulated by APRA do use services provided by Optus or Telstra in relation to how they perform their daily functions. Now, they are more than likely to be critical third-party providers or even fourth-party providers, depending on the systems that are used. So seeing how this plays through, not only the view that ASIC may take in relation to Optus, but how APRA may look at firms that utilise Optus and whether they are changing their either DR or BCP plans as a result of this will be quite interesting. Like, for this to happen at this occasion, it's terrible for Optus, it's terrible for their customers, but it really provides some insight as to where this could go if there is a major outage of a third or fourth party provider, which has been mentioned previously, where there is reliance by a number of entities on it. So it's an interesting space, and I think, as I've mentioned, making sure you're always thinking about how you can reduce that disruption is pivotal. And is it feasible to have two service providers? These are questions people may need to answer going forward.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure people are wondering why CPS is limited to just APRA regulated or just financial services. So it throws up a lot of questions, but let's get right into the detail next and talk about the actual plans themselves. Susanna, can you run us through what's required of the BCP?
Entities are required to have a comprehensive BCP that includes a register of critical operations and the tolerance levels, triggers for identifying disruptions and activating the plan, along with resource allocation arrangements, strategies for maintaining critical operations within tolerance levels during disruptions, assessment of execution risks, necessary resources, preparatory measures, and dependencies to implement the BCP effectively, and a communication strategy to facilitate plan execution. An APRA-regulated entity is obligated to maintain the necessary capabilities to execute BCP, ensuring access to people, resources, and technology. They must also regularly monitor their compliance with tolerance levels and promptly report any failure to meet these levels to the board, along with a remediation plan. An APRA-regulated entity is required to promptly inform APRA within a maximum of 24 hours if it experiences a significant disruption to a critical operation that exceeds acceptable limits. The notification should include details about the disruption's nature, the steps taken in response, the expected impact on the entity's business operations, and the estimated timeframe for returning to normal operations. APRA expects that an organisation's BCP will outline all stages of disruptions to critical operations and include triggers and identifications, initial actions such as alternative arrangements, further actions, assessment, and communications. A BCP should be practical, concise, and easy to action. However, BCPs, including disaster recovery plans, need to be sufficiently detailed so that execution does not rely on the knowledge and experience of an individual staff. And lastly, where BCPs involve the use of alternative locations for the delivery of critical operations, an entity would typically need to ensure that these alternative locations are unlikely to be impacted by the same disruption, are accessible in a timely manner, are clearly identified within the BCPs, are usable for the duration of the disruption, and meet all legal and regulatory requirements, including security, health, and safety considerations.
Thank you for that. I know there's a lot of detail in what's required there, but so important. And another significant part of the regulations is testing and review. So, Susanna, again, can you run us through what the regulations require there?
An APRA-regulated entity must have a systematic testing program for its BCP that covers all critical operations and includes an annual business continuity exercise. The program must test the effectiveness of the entity's BCP and its ability to meet tolerance levels in a range of severe but plausible scenarios. The concept of what is severe but plausible, in our view, would differ for each organisation and the organisation's risk appetite. We are aware from our conversations with the industry that this is a tricky part of CPS 230 to implement. We will be holding workshops in early 2024 on this topic. But the testing program must be tailored to material risks of the APRA-regulated entity and include a range of severe but plausible scenarios, including disruptions to services provided by the material service providers and scenarios where contingency arrangements are required. APRA may require the inclusion of an APRA-determined scenario in a business continuity exercise for an entity or a class of entities.
Perfect. Thanks for that. Richard, I don't know if you've got any comments on severe but plausible.
No, I think severe and plausible, I think we've seen this before and we've seen this in other testing scenarios. Like, who would have ever thought there'd be a global pandemic that would have, had everyone working from home? I think the Ukraine-Russia war, I don't think there would have been many scenarios that people would have had in that, just in relation to market risk and volatility. And I think this is where the regulators will be looking for businesses to be a little more creative in relation to what their plans are for when they're testing. And like trying to make testing is like, it's key because it provides useful information to enable you to implement the plan when real issues arise. And by doing this and not going through the motions, only having a select number of people that know about it and sort of seeing how it works in real life with lessons learned is really useful. And I know that we've used this in other firms we've been involved with, is doing the tests and checking contact numbers and response times at 2 a.m, 4 a.m, 11 p.m. is key, because can you imagine the phone calls that would have been going on if they had service at Optus at 4 a.m. when things started to go down? So you do need to test it. You've got to test it, particularly if you're a global business. At weird times where people may not be around. Friday nights is always a great test. And, then thinking of what could really put your business under strain so you cannot provide the regulated services that clients are paying you for.
Excellent insights there. And Susanna, how often should testing occur?
Systematic testing of BCPs and associated disaster recovery plans will typically occur on a cycle to ensure all critical operations are covered over a specified multi-year time frame, for example, 3 years. There is no expectation that all severe but plausible scenarios are tested every year, but specific test frequency and rigour should ideally be proportionate to the impact of the plausible disruption scenarios. APRA has said that the aim of testing are to highlight any deficiencies build experience in managing a crisis, and proactively strengthen the BCP, and ultimately ensure an entity is prepared should an actual disruption occur. Testing and review is going to be a lengthy task for some, and with the requirements for simulations and reporting, it may necessitate organisations to review and reassess their technological capabilities. However, an organisation should go about this. How an organisation should go about this will be different for everyone, but make sure your organisation has turned its mind to the time, resources and technology that this part of CPS 230 implementation may require as early as possible.
Absolutely. And look, a good way to approach the concepts of tolerances, testing and review would probably be to consider some of your past incidents and consider the severity, effect and outcome and remediation approach that you took in each case. Richard, any final thoughts there on how to tackle testing?
No, I think we've covered it. I think, you learn the more you test, the better you will be when a real incident arises. And it will also pick out flaws in your plan. And I think it demonstrates, that if you aren't able to get all your services up within the tolerance levels that you've outlined, it demonstrates to the regulator that you were taking reasonable steps. Sometimes, you are going to have complications in implementing your plan. And if you have gone through that, and you can demonstrate previously that that was working, that may give you some leeway with the regulator when you're being called to account if you have had an outage which has gone beyond what both the customer, your tolerance levels and the regulators think is appropriate.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's just take another really quick poll now, audience. Let's quantify the scale of your problem. When it comes to BCM, what do you think is going to be your biggest challenge? Developing the BCP, implementing it, tolerances or testing and review? Please do vote there through the Slido that is on screen now. Just give you a minute to do that. I think it's probably it looks like setting tolerances is one of the tricky ones, and rightly so. But then obviously testing and review is pretty close behind that as well. Okay, so let's just move on now. Richard, from a practical perspective, any kind of red flags or tips that people should be looking out for?
I think just making sure that it's plan's easily digestible. I think, as we said before, it's employee agnostic, which means someone can pick up the plan. You're able to utilize the plan. There's not key person dependencies. I think we've discussed this, thinking about plausible scenarios, and draw on. I've already mentioned Optus, but you've also got the Medibank data breach and Latitude cyber attacks. The pandemic's a great one, just to look back and lessons learned in relation to that. But that can also demonstrate what you did well and what now has evolved in your business since then. And I think even there were third-party clearing services issues with the RBA not that long ago. And how would that impact you, and what would you do in that circumstance? So real-life examples, constant testing, communication up to date in relation to who needs to be spoken to when. And I think also making sure that you're able to communicate with your customers in a timely manner will be fundamental.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that. And so given that compliance needs to be evidence in 2024, we've got a bit of a summary here. Sorry, can we go back one slide on the key things you need to do now? Susanna, what are those?
Some of the key things I would start doing are listed there on the slide, but the ones that I would start with would be identifying critical operations. That will be, a big task for some. Create a register of critical operations and the tolerance levels for each critical operation, especially for reporting purposes. Documenting the processes and resources needed to deliver the critical operations. Update the BCP and the triggers and processes for activating it, and setting tolerance levels for each critical operation.
Richard, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, make also sure that you do focus on operations that are undertaken by third and fourth parties and your internal processes, and give deep thought as to what are the appropriate tolerance levels for these critical operations. And as we've just mentioned, review your testing plans, plausible scenarios, and I would enact tests on a regular basis so you can learn and be able to respond in the appropriate timeframe.
Absolutely. Okay, so I know we are nearly at time. On the next slide there, you'll see some ways in which we are helping clients now to implement the requirements of CPS 230. And as you can see, it is very operational. We do augment your team with flex resources and technology solutions to get you through periods of high workload. And of course, we're certainly in demand during regulatory change. So if you do need help, please do reach out early and start talking to us so that your team can flex over the next 12 months and ensure that your BCM and plans are in place by the deadline. Okay, so we are at time, and unfortunately we have run out of time for to grill the panel with some Q&A, but please do drop your questions into the Q&A tab and we will come back to you directly with those answers. We're going to be continuing to run this webinar series regularly so you can keep up to date with all reg change coming at you. Great insights today. Thank you, panel, for joining me. And if you do need support on your CPS 230 uplift now, or you think you'll need support going forward, please do reach out. Thank you for your time today, and we'll see you at the next webinar.